We're interested in three things on this course: philosophical theories about action and about joint action, psychological theories of the same, and formal theories which attempt to capture those things, namely decision theory and in the future game theory. And of course we want to connect up all of those three things together. How do those things connect up? That's really what you can do on this course that you can't do in any of the subjects that you study individually, like psychology, economics, or philosophy. So right now we're interested in this connection between decision theory as a formal method and psychological theories about the nature of action. Now, in fact, the objection that I'm going to consider will apply to you regardless of your theory about action, as long as you're committed to the idea that there are goal-directed processes. So if you think there are no goal-directed processes, you don't have a problem. Otherwise, you do. But I'm focusing on the dual process theory of instrumental action specifically, because in my view, that's far and away the best theory that we have. It's the best developed theoretically, and it's the best supported by evidence. And it's also, I think, the most interesting. Now, you'll remember that when we formulate the dual process theory of instrumental action, we have to specify what a habitual process is and what a goal-directed process is. Now, we didn't cover this in a lot of detail, but it turns out that when it comes to the habitual processes, we can specify these in an extremely rigorous way, right? So we've considered this in a slightly informal way to make it a bit easier on the course, but there is a very deep rabbit hole you can go down in characterizing what a habitual process is based on decades of very careful specification from the outside. But when it comes to the goal-directed process, things are a lot looser. Now, it's true that Dickinson himself doesn't usually use the term belief or desire. He talks about representations of action-outcome links and representations of value, I think, or desirability. But even so, right, it's unclear what those representations are. We don't have the same depth of theory to explain them. So we come across an immediate problem when we want to characterize goal-directed processes. What are these beliefs? What are these desires? And here I think it's absolutely no good to appeal to kind of common sense understanding of those things, because generally speaking, that won't help us when we're trying to develop scientific theories and contrast them with perhaps quite closely related ones. Also won't help us to appeal to what philosophers have said, because no two philosophers will agree with each other about the nature of belief. There's just too much diversity in the philosophers' views for us to think that they've got a handle on what these things are. If they really had a handle on what these things are, I think we wouldn't see disagreement about the fundamental nature of these attitudes. So the attraction of decision theory is that we could replace beliefs with subjective probabilities. We could replace desires with preferences. And then we've got a super easy answer to these questions. They're just the constructs of game theory. Here's game theory. There is as much understanding as you could possibly want of them. Now, importantly, in order to characterize a goal-directed process, it's not enough for us to say what the belief-like and desire-like states are. We also have to say how those states interact in order to generate action. And even if you weren't skeptical as I am that we really do understand what belief or desire is, it's still a fair point that it's very hard to say in any clear way what it is that takes you from the particular beliefs and the particular desires you have to an action. It's very clear to do more than wave your hands about that. And once again, the appeal to decision theory provides us with an attractively clear answer to the question. The agent's subjective probabilities and preferences determine expected utilities of various actions that are open to the agent, and the agent then just selects the action with the most expected utility. It's simple, it's beautiful, it's perfectly clear. Unfortunately, it runs into an interesting objection. Sorry, Jeffrey's here again. So I've mentioned this before. I keep mentioning this. I love this quote. Jeffrey is offering decision theory as an elucidation of these notions of subjective probability and subjective desirability. So I think that although he's not thinking specifically about psychological theories of action, this is a paradigm application of decision theory that ought to be taken more seriously. But as you know, we run straight into a problem here. And the problem is this. We know that agents who make certain choices, certain patterns of choice, do not have subjective probabilities or preferences at all. This is because those combinations of choices imply that we have a violation of the axioms of decision theory And those are the axioms relative to which preferences are constructs. So if your pattern of preferences shows that your axioms are violated, we can't kind of say, well, you've got preferences, but they're not rational. We just can't make any sense at all of the idea that you have preferences. The assumption that your choices accord with the axioms is something that's essential for us to make sense of the idea that there is anything that you prefer at all, if we go with the decision theory notion. So there are certain patterns of choice which can imply that you do not have preferences at all. And further, we know from studying things like the Ellsberg paradox that many agents do in fact make such choices. Right? There are other paradoxes as well. And although we haven't looked carefully at any data on this, there is plenty if you look for it. So what generally happens in people who are doing research on decision theory is that they'll first of all offer you an informal suggestion that people are probably going to be irrational in this case. And then a few years later, the scientists will come along and sort of demonstrate that actually people do generally behave in the irrational way as predicted. Usually what happens. So this has an interesting consequence for us. If we're going to characterize the goal-directed processes in terms of game theory, then it looks like we're denying that the goal-directed processes occur in agents who suffer from things like aversion to ambiguity and the other conditions that explain those irrational choices. Why is that? Well, the goal-directed processes are characterized in terms of having preferences. Preferences are thought of as constructs of decision theory, but those people, probably like you, certainly like me, who make the set of choices in the Ellsberg paradox, which implies we do not have preferences, therefore also are not guided by any goal-directed processes. Now, I take it that this is completely untenable because the evidence that not all of our actions are guided by habitual processes does not depend at all right, on us performing in one way or another. So a lot of the evidence concerns the behaviour of rats. So we think that we have good evidence that in rats, some actions are influenced not just by habitual and other processes, but also by goal-directed processes. And it would hardly be a good objection to those studies to say, well, you know, the rats are a bit like the humans in that they're making this apparently irrational set of choices in the Ellsberg paradox. That wouldn't work at all. So I take it that the consequence is completely untenable. What therefore should we do? What should we do? And actually, when I say what should we do, I mean what should you do? Because this is where I'm going to, leave things in your hands, right? This is your problem to solve, and I'm afraid I genuinely don't have an answer. I would like to have an answer, but that's one of the reasons why I chose to inflict this topic on you. I think there are, broadly speaking, three options. There may be more, but I can see three. One is that we might find a way to hold on to game theory despite the objections. Now, I have no idea how we're going to do that, but I recognise that people here are pretty inventive, so it might be that you can think of something. Perhaps I'm just missing something, right? A second might be to consider an alternative formalisation. So there's a wide range of what are sometimes called non-expected utility theories, where researchers are trying to give a somewhat formal or sometimes very formal characterization, which takes into account all of the actual observed behaviours. Perhaps the leading example of this is cumulative prospect theory. And I don't know very much about cumulative prospect theory at all, but I noticed that Tversky and Kahneman, in their 92 paper of this is the second on prospect theory where they revise it, they're explicitly talking about the Ellsberg effect, which they understand as people preferring some kinds of risk to others and trying to accommodate those findings. So it's possible that there's an alternative formulation that would work much better for us, relative to which we can still characterize subjective probabilities and preferences and the way that those lead to actions, that would also allow us to specify what we mean by goal-directed process, and we could make good progress there. So this is a live option. The reason that I can't say much about this is just because I don't know much. I just don't know much about non-expected utility theories and what they would allow us to characterize and whether they would be a good fit for the kind of data that we're trying to explain when we're trying to explain commonalities, for example, in the behavior of the rats and the humans across these different experiments. Now, a third option, which I think might be most appealing to people whose background is mainly philosophical, is to find an informal way to characterize these processes. I'm quite tempted by the thought that there may not be a formal theory that allows us to characterise the notions of belief and desire that we need to understand goal-directed processes. There may even be some in-principle reasons why that's not possible. One sort of motivation for thinking that that might be the case is reflection on what happens when people try to construct formal models of knowledge. What we know from the history of those attempts is that you quickly run into some extreme difficulties if you're trying to characterize the kind of knowledge that might explain action. Once you bring the relation between knowledge and action into the picture, you seem to run up against some pretty hard limits on what can be characterized in a formal theory. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea, I don't know if this is true, but that we might just need to find an informal way to characterize these processes. That may well be true. On the other hand, I think as philosophers, we sometimes think of this as too easy. You see, I'm a philosopher, and I love nothing more than to spot a problem, than to be confronted with a question. But we also want to understand action in a way that's clear enough that we can make some interesting distinctions, that we can distinguish between perhaps a more sophisticated and a less sophisticated goal-directed process. Why not? You see, goal-directed processes are guiding the behaviour of a wide range of different animals, rats and humans and many others besides. It's probable that there's more than one kind of goal-directed process. Some are more sophisticated, some are less sophisticated. It may even be that in addition to the habitual and the goal-directed processes, there are actually multiple goal-directed processes, all of which are influencing a single action. Who knows? It's perfectly possible. But without some substantial progress in understanding how to characterize belief and desire and the way that they influence action, we're not really in a good position to make those kind of distinctions in a way that will allow us to generate readily testable predictions. So my thought is this: the informal characterization, maybe that we're stuck with it, and it's certainly proved useful because it's allowed us to distinguish habitual and goal-directed processes. So we did get some way with the informal characterization, but it's not clear to me that we can make a lot of further progress with the informal characterization as it stands. It seems like we may need to go a bit further here. So that's a challenge. So as I said, this isn't something that I have anything to contribute on. This is the problem which I have set for you. What should we do, given, on the one hand, that we do need to say something about what those goal-directed processes are in order to make further progress in distinguishing and understanding the causes of action and how actions are selected. On the other hand, the most appealing and straightforward option, appealing to decision theory, drives us straight into a completely untenable position, the position of denying that there are goal-directed processes guiding my actions and perhaps, if you're like me, your actions. So what should we do?